They didn't like saying it out loud. That was the first thing I noticed. Not fear exactly, reluctance. The kind that settles into people who've lived long enough behind something they can't remove, only avoid. The name Bloody Bones didn't pass easily from mouth to mouth. It stuck in the throat, bent conversations sideways. When it appeared, it was usually disguised as a joke or softened into something meant for children. That should have been the warning. I first heard it in a rural stretch of early American countryside where roads still followed land instead of conquering it. A place shaped by settlers who brought stories with them across the ocean and then watched those stories change once they touched new soil. Old English cautionary tales don't survive the Atlantic unchanged. They shed manners. They grow teeth. I was staying near a marsh-fed creek, the kind that looks shallow until you step wrong. The water there didn't move quickly, but it never stayed still either. It breathed, rose and fell in slow, patient pulses, leaving behind slick banks and exposed roots like ribs. That was where the locals said Bloody Bones lived, not in the water, beneath it. They told the story the way people do when they want distance, vague, inconsistent, threaded with laughter that arrived half a second too late. Bloody Bones was what you told children so they won't wander. Bloody Bones was how you explained why livestock avoided certain bends in the creek. Bloody Bones was old, older than fences, older than names that stuck. But when I asked where the story came from, no one answered directly. They spoke instead about disappearances that didn't escalate, a boy who slipped and was never found, though the water was too shallow to claim him, a hunter whose dog refused to cross a particular stretch of bank, winning until its voice gave out, bones turning up downstream that didn't belong to anything local, too clean, too polished. The creek wasn't loud. That was another thing that unsettled me. No rushing water, no dramatic churn, just a soft, constant movement, as if something beneath the surface was shifting its weight over and over again, never fully settling. I walked it on evening as the light began to fail. The air smelled of wet earth and iron. That scent lingered longer than I should have. I remembered kneeling near the edge, testing the ground with a stick, watching how the mud pulled at it when I tried to lift it back out. The resistance was intimate, grasping, like the ground didn't want to give back what it had been offered. That's when I heard the sound. Not a splash, not movement. A slow, deliberate suction, wet and careful, followed by the faintest drag, as if something heavy had shifted just beneath the surface without breaking it. The water rippled outward in a perfect circle, too clean to be natural. I froze. The locals said Bloody Bones didn't chase. It waited. It let people do the dangerous part themselves. I stood there longer than I should have, watching the ripples dissolve, feeling the air thicken around me. I didn't see anything rise, nothing surfaced, but the sense of being observed was unmistakable, not from the banks, not from the trees, but from directly below my feet. That was the moment I understood something important. Bloody Bones wasn't a monster you encountered. It was a consequence you stepped into. And once the creek noticed you, once it adjusted to your weight, your balance, your hesitation, it didn't need to reach up at all. It only needed you to lean forward. I learned quickly that the creek behaved differently once you had been noticed. Not visibly, not in ways you could point to and warn someone else about. The change was more personal than that. The ground near the banks seemed to recognize my footsteps, softening where it shouldn't, firming where it had no reason to. Each step felt negotiated, as if the land itself was deciding how much of me it was willing to hold. I stopped walking directly beside the water after that first evening. Instead, I kept a careful distance, following the tree line where roots broke the surface and offered something solid to trust. Even then, I could feel the pull, not physical, not quiet, but suggestive, a quiet invitation to misjudge. People underestimate how much danger depends on timing. Slip at the right moment and you fall cleanly. Slip at the wrong one and something catches you halfway down. Bloody Bones lived in that margin. It didn't need depth, it needed interruption. I began asking more questions. The answers, when they came, were fragmented. Stories passed down not as warnings, but as explanations after the fact. A way to close the space left behind when something went wrong and no one wanted to examine why. They said Bloody Bones collected what the land rejected, that it assembled itself slowly from what sank and didn't return, that bones polished by water lost their memory of the body they once held and became something new when gathered long enough. One woman told me, quietly, without looking at the creek, that Bloody Bones didn't always stay submerged. On certain nights, when the air grew heavy and the insects went silent, it would rise just enough for the waterline to mark it. A shape defined by absence, gaps where flesh should have been, weight without outline. She stopped talking after that. I returned to the creek again just before dusk against my better judgment. The surface looked unchanged, the dimming sky in fractured pieces. I tested the ground ahead of me with the stick again, pressing deeper this time. The mud gave way suddenly, not collapsing, opening. I jerked back instinctively, heart racing, breath sharp in my throat. The stick slid forward on its own, disappearing beneath the surface with a soft, final sound. No splash, no resistance, just acceptance. The water closed over it immediately, smooth as glass. That was when I felt it, a subtle shift in pressure beneath my boots, as if something below had adjusted position, settled closer to the surface. The creek hadn't reacted to the stick, it had reacted to me. I stepped back slowly, careful not to rush, aware now that speed won't help. Panic made mistakes easier. Bloody Bones didn't need fear, it needed imbalance. As I retreated, the water stirred again, not outward, but inward, a faint inward draw, like a breath taken below the surface. I didn't wait to see what followed. But even as I put distance between myself and the creek, I carried the certainty with me that something beneath that water now understood my shape, my weight, and exactly how easily I might be taken apart. After that, I stopped pretending I was an observer. Observation implies distance. The creek had erased that illusion. Whatever Bloody Bones was, it had already accounted for me. The only question left was how long it would wait before acting on the calculation. I noticed changes upstream first, small ones, easy to miss if you weren't looking for patterns. The water level didn't rise, but the banks looked worked, not eroded, arranged. Exposed roots lay cleaner than they should have, stripped off mud as if rubbed bare by something patient. Stones clustered where there had been none before, nudged into shallow arcs that guided the flow inward. Traps without edges. I followed the creek's curve carefully, never placing my weight near the water without testing first. Even then, the ground seemed eager to deceive. Areas that had held firm days earlier softened without warning, while slick sections hardened just long enough to invite a step. It felt deliberate. I found bones that afternoon, not scattered, sorted. They lay half buried near a bend when the current slowed, arranged in loose groupings that made no anatomical sense. A rib beside a knuckle, a jaw fragment placed carefully against a smooth stone, too clean, too deliberate to be natural drift. They weren't old. The marrow had been scored away, leaving the surfaces pale and polished, almost reflective in the failing light. They looked worked over, handled repeatedly until whatever they had once belonged to no longer mattered. I understood then why the name endured. Bloody Bones wasn't singular, it was cumulative. Every lose fed it, every misstep added structure. Whatever lay beneath the creek wasn't wearing a body, it was assembling one, piece by piece, drawn together by weight, by water, by the simple fact that the land refused to give back what it had taken. The air grew heavy as evening closed in. Insects faded out one by one until the silence felt intentional. I stood very still, listening to the slow movement of water and something else beneath it. A low internal shift, like sediment being rearranged far below. The surface broke then, not violently, not fully. A section of water bulged upward, stretching without splashing, as if something beneath had risen just enough to test resistance. For a moment I thought I could see shape within it, angles where there should have been none, hard lines pressing against soft boundaries. Then it settled again. The creek returned to its careful calm. I didn't run. Running would have invited pursuit, and Bloody Bones didn't chase anyway. Instead, I backed away slowly, every muscle tight, aware that the land itself had become an extension of whatever waited below. As I reached firmer ground, I realized something else. The bones near the bend had shifted. Not much, just enough to suggest they were being gathered. And somewhere beneath the water, something heavy adjusted its weight again, patient, methodical, and very aware that I now understood what the creek kept, and what it still wanted. I didn't go back to the creek next day. That wasn't caution, it was instinct. The same reflex that pulls your hand away from heat before pain arrives. Whatever boundary I had crossed, it had been acknowledged. Distance felt like the only response that wouldn't accelerate things. The creek disagreed. I noticed it in the way the ground held moisture farther from the waterline than it had before. Mud crept into places that had stayed dry for years. Footpaths softened overnight. The land around the creek was expanding its influence, quietly rewriting where it was allowed to exist. Bloody Bones wasn't leaving the water, it was bringing the water with it. I woke before dawn to the sound of movement outside my lodging. Not footsteps, not animals, but a slow, dragging shift, like something heavy being repositioned just beyond sight. When I stepped outside, the air smelled of iron again, stronger now, clinging to the ground. The creek's edge had advanced, not flooded, extended. Thin fingers of wet earth stretched into the grass, glossy in the early light, as if the land had been pressed outward from below. The water itself remained contained, but its reach had grown, marking new territory. That's when I saw the impression. A shallow depression in the mud near the bank, too broad to be a footprint, too structured to be collapse. It looked like something had learned there. Something had leaned there, bracing itself, testing the surface. The edges were smooth, the center compacted, as if weight had been distributed carefully to avoid breaking through. I followed the impression along the bank and found more. Not prints, supports, places where the ground had been compressed in repeating intervals, spaced evenly apart, suggesting a method of movement that relied on leverage rather than legs. The pattern traced a slow arc along the creek's curve, then stopped, right where the bank grew narrowest. I didn't need to see it rise to understand what had happened. Bloody Bones had learned where the land could hold it. The realization came with a cold clarity. Whatever it was assembling beneath the water was no longer content to remain submerged. The creek had provided materials, the bank was providing structure. All that remained was timing. That night, the silence returned earlier than usual. Frogs cut off mid-call. Insects faded until the darkness felt thick enough to press against. I stayed inside, lights low, listening to the absence of sound and the distant, almost imperceptible drag of something heavy shifting mud. Just once, then stopping. I didn't sleep. Near dawn, I heard the faintest disturbance from the direction of the creek. Not a splash, not movement, but the sound of wet earth settling under weight that had been briefly misplaced. Whatever Bloody Bones was becoming, it had tested the bank, and it had learned how much of itself the land would allow above water before it had to sink back down again. Next time, it won't need to guess. The change wasn't aggressive. That was the most unsettling part. The creek didn't surge or overflow. It didn't claw at the banks or announce its presence with sound. Instead, it became helpful. Subtle adjustments appeared overnight, small channels forming where water could move more easily, patches of ground forming unexpectedly, as if the land itself were offering safer passage. It was an invitation. I tested it once, against my better judgment. A narrow stretch of bank that had been treacherous days earlier now held my weight without complaint. The mud there was compacted, smoothed, almost engineered. It felt intentional, like a path prepared in advance. Bloody Bones was learning how to guide. I followed the creek's curve again, keeping to the newly stable ground, aware that every step I took along it confirmed something. The bones I'd seen before were gone, not scattered, not buried, removed entirely, as if recalled. The water moved differently now. Its surface broke into small, overlapping ripples that traveled inward rather than downstream, converging at a point just beneath the bank. The air above that spot felt dense, pressing lightly against my skin. I stopped. The ground ahead of me dipped slightly, then held. A shallow slope leading closer to the water, firm enough to trust, gentle enough to invite misjudgment. I could feel the calculation beneath it, how far I might lean before my center of gravity betrayed me. I stepped back. The ground responded. The slope shifted, almost imperceptibly, tightening its angle. The firmness remained, but the margin of error narrowed. Bloody Bones wasn't forcing me forward. It was adjusting conditions. That was when I understood the patience behind it. The creature didn't need to rush. It had time. The creek had been claiming things long before I arrived. All it needed was a body willing to test its generosity one step too far. As I retreated again, the surface of the water bulged faintly, not breaking, just pressing upward as if something beneath had leaned closer. I could feel the mass of it now, not a single shape, but a convergence. Weight gathered from many sources, held together by pressure and repetition. I left the area before dusk, taking a longer route away from the creek. Even at a distance, I could feel it working, reshaping the bank, refining the offer it would make next time. Bloody Bones didn't hunt. It prepared, and the land, slowly and willingly, learned how to help it. The creek dropped overnight, not enough to draw attention, just a few inches, the kind of change locals would blame on weather patterns or underground flow. But I noticed immediately because the land it revealed wasn't raw or newly exposed. It had been waiting. Mud that should have been slick held a dull, worked sheen, smoothed by contact that hadn't come from water alone. Stones sat half embedded in deliberate placements, forming shallow braces along the exposed channel. The creek hadn't receded randomly. It had been emptied with purpose. I followed the lured line carefully, staying well back from the edge. What lay exposed between water and bank wasn't a path, exactly, but it wasn't chaos either. The ground bore the subtle signs of pressure applied and released repeatedly, compacted arcs, shallow grooves, places where something heavy had shifted its weight without fully committing. That's when I saw it, not fully, a portion, near the center of the creek bed, where the water still pooled darkly. Something pale interrupted the brown-gray monotony of mud. At first I mistook it for stone, then I noticed the curve. Bone, not scattered, not deposited by chance. It rose vertically from the muck, anchored below the surface, polished smooth by long submersion. More followed, partial structures emerging where the water had withdrawn, a section of spine without context, a mass of interlocked joints too dense to belong to any single body. Bloody bones had been assembling itself below the waterline. The creek lowering wasn't environmental, it was preparatory. I stayed very still, aware now that the reduced water wasn't a retreat, it was accommodation, making space for something that needed leverage. The exposed bones didn't move, but the mud around them did, settling, tightening, locking them in place. A shape was being tested. I felt it before I heard anything, a subtle tremor underfoot, not from impact, but from redistribution. Something below shifted its mass, aligning supports, testing how much of itself the bank could tolerate before failing. The water stirred then, not outward, but inward again, drawn toward the cluster of bones like breath returning to lungs. The exposed structures sank slightly, not disappearing, just repositioning. The creek wasn't revealing bloody bones yet. It was calibrating the emergence. I backed away slowly, every step measured, conscious of how the ground responded. Even at a distance, I could feel the creek's attention remain fixed on the place where I'd stopped, not following me, accounting for me. By the time the light began to fail, the waterline had stabilized again, concealing most of what I'd seen, but I knew now what lay beneath it. Bloody Bones was no longer incomplete. It was waiting for the night conditions to rise far enough to anchor itself to the bank, not permanently, not fully, just long enough to borrow the land's support. And once it learned that, the creek would no longer need depth to keep what it took. I understood then why people disappeared without struggle. Bloody Bones didn't overwhelm, it normalized. That night, the boundary between land and water stopped behaving like a boundary at all. I noticed it first by absence. The usual warning signs were gone. No slick sheen on the mud, no deceptive softness, no sudden give beneath careful steps. The creek edge looked honest, stable, almost welcoming. The kind of terrain that encourages confidence without announcing danger. That should have frightened me more than anything I had seen so far. I stood well back and watched as dusk folded itself over the trees. The creek reflected the darkening sky in long, calm stretches, unbroken by ripple or insect. It looked inert, finished, as though whatever process had been unfolding was complete. Then the ground settled, not collapsed, not shifted. It simply accepted weight that hadn't been there a moment earlier. The bank compressed in a smooth, controlled manner, as if something unseen had leaned into it carefully, distributing its mass with practiced precision. I felt the vibration through my boots, a low, subsonic tremor that traveled sideways rather than outward, spreading along the bank in a way that suggested contact across multiple points at once. Bloody Bones wasn't pressing up in one place. It was bracing itself everywhere it could. The waterline lowered again, just enough to expose more structure, not a body, not yet, but supports. Reinforced arcs of bones locked together by mud and pressure, pieces that had no business fitting yet somehow did, held by repetition rather than design. I realized then that Bloody Bones didn't rise like a creature. It assembled vertically, layer by layer, weight added slowly. The creak gave it material, the bank gave it leverage, time gave it cohesion. I smelled iron again, thick and metallic, carried on air that felt suddenly too still. The scent didn't drift, it lingered, clinging low to the ground, pooling where the land dipped toward the water. That's when the silence broke, not with sound, with interruption. A night insect began its call and stopped mid-note. Another followed and cut off just as abruptly. The darkness itself seemed to hesitate, as if waiting for confirmation that it was safe to proceed. The creak answered instead. A slow, wet compression echoed faintly beneath the surface, not movement, but pressure settling into place. Something heavy had finished leaning. I stepped back instinctively, but the ground behind me remained firm. Too firm. The land was holding, not for me, but for whatever had just completed its adjustment. That was the moment I understood the final danger. Bloody Bones didn't need the creek anymore. The creek had only been a workshop. Once enough for of itself could be supported by land, even briefly, it could claim without water. A misstep won't mean drowning. It would mean being pinned, held by something that had learned exactly how much force was required to keep a human body from escaping without tearing itself apart. I didn't wait to see how much of it would rise. I retreated slowly, deliberately, every movement calculated not to introduce imbalance. Behind me, the creek remained unnervingly calm, its surface smoothing over the work beneath it. But I could feel it, not watching me, not following me, simply aware that I was still intact. For now, Bloody Bones had learned the land. Next, it would let the land learn me. I used to believe silence was just the absence of sound. That's what cities teach you. Noise is normal, and quiet is a pause between engines, voices, screens. But the silence out there was something else entirely. It wasn't empty. It was crowded, packed tight with things holding their breath. The night I crossed the creek for the third time, I understood that the woods were no longer ignoring me. They were responding. I had gone back alone. That part still shocks people when I tell it, how casually I say it, like it wasn't the dumbest decision of my life. But obsession doesn't feel reckless when you are inside it. It feels necessary. Like something unfinished has hooked itself behind your ribs and won't let go until you follow. The creek was higher than before, swollen from rain that hadn't touched the town. The water moved fast, black and muscular, dragging leaves and branches like offerings. I crossed barefoot, boots slung around my neck, feeling for stones with my toes. Halfway across, The current pushed hard enough to knock my balance sideways, and for a second I thought, this is it. This is how it ends, dragged under without ever knowing what I was chasing. But the water let me pass. That thought came to me uninvited, fully formed, and it chilled me more than the cold biting into my calves. Not I made it across. It let me. On the far bank, the forest felt different, denser, as if the air itself had weight. My flashlight beam didn't cut as far as it used to. It was swallowed quicker, absorbed by dark and shadow. The trees were closer together here, their branches knotting overhead into something like a rib cage. Walking into it felt like stepping inside a body. Every sound I made came back altered. My breath echoed wrong. My footfalls returned a half-second late, softer than they should have been, like someone mimicking me from farther back. I stopped twice just to test it, stood completely still, counted my breaths, waited. That's when I heard the second set of steps, not behind me, beside me, slow, careful, matching my pace exactly, even when I wasn't moving. I told myself it was animals, the way you always do, even when you know better. Deer, raccoons, anything that lets you keep walking without running. I kept my eyes forward. The path, if you could call it that, sloped downward, winding between trees that leaned inward as though listening. And then, without warning, the forest opened. I stepped into a clearing I'd never seen before. It was circular, too perfect to be natural. The ground dipped slightly in the center, and the grass there was pressed flat, darkened as if something heavy had for a very long time. No fire pit, no stones, no sign of human hands, except the smell. Iron, old leaves, wet stone, and underneath it all, something sharp and sweet that made my stomach turn. I knew that smell. I'd smelled it once before years ago at the edge of a highway where a truck had hit a deer and kept going. Blood left too long in the open doesn't smell like blood anymore. It smells like memory rotting. My flashlight flickered, once, twice. Then it steadied, but the clearing looked different. At first I thought my eyes were adjusting. Then I realized the trees around the circle were wrong. Their trunks were scarred with long vertical grooves, deep enough that you could fit fingers inside them. Dozens of marks, all at roughly the same height, spiraling the perimeter like tally marks. Scratches don't do that. Scratches are messy, panicked. These were deliberate. I walked the circle slowly, counting steps without meaning to. 32 from edge to edge, 32 back. The center pulled at me, subtle but insistent, like gravity had been recalibrated there. That's when the woods spoke. Not out loud, inside. You came back. The thought wasn't in my voice. It wasn't in any voice. It was simply there, pressed into my skull like a thumbprint. I staggered, nearly dropping the flashlight. My heart slammed so hard I thought it might knock my ribs loose. I said nothing. I knew, instinctively, that answering would be a mistake. The pressure increased. You crossed the water again. Images flickered behind my eyes. The creek at night, the way the current curled around stones. The moment my foot slipped, it wasn't remembering, it was replaying. I didn't. I started, then bit the words back before they fully formed. The air in the clearing shifted. Leaves rustled without wind. The scratches on the trees seemed darker now, wet at the edges as if freshly opened. You followed the signs. The presence continued. You heard the calling. Calling. That word hit harder than anything else, because I had. God help me, I had. The sounds at night, the shapes at the edge of vision, the dreams where I was walking through trees that leaned closer with every step. I hadn't told anyone about those dreams. My knees went weak. I sat down hard at the edge of the pressed grass, unable to trust my legs anymore. The ground there was warm, not sun warm, body warm. You're not real, I whispered, even as part of me knew how hollow it sounded. This is stress, sleep deprivation, fear. The clearing answered by showing me something. The grass in the center began to move, not swaying, but flattening further, as though something invisible were lowering itself down, slowly, carefully, respectfully. An outline formed, long limbs, a hunched shape, not animal, not human. The air bent around it, distorting the flashlight beam so that looking directly at it made my head ache. I couldn't see it, but I could feel where it wasn't. Cold pooled around the shape, draining warmth from my skin, my breath fogged, thick and white, even though it wasn't that cold. We watched you learn the paths. It pressed into me. We watched you listen. Images poured in unsacked, unasked. People walking these woods decades ago, centuries ago, some alone, some in groups, some carrying lanterns, some carrying nothing at all of them looking over their shoulders by the time they reached the creek. Not all crossings are meant to be returned from. Something brushed my arm. I screamed then. I won't pretend otherwise. A raw, tearing sound ripped out of me before I could stop it. The invisible shape recoiled, not in fear, but in surprise, like it hadn't expected that reaction. The woods erupted. Every tree groaned at once, not snapping, groaning like old wood under bearable weight. The steps I'd been hearing multiplied, dozens now, circling the clearing just beyond the tree line. I could sense them without seeing them, a ring of attention closing in. The presence shifted. You are loud, it observed. I scrambled backward, palms scraping against dirt, unable to take my eyes off the place where the shape hovered. What do you want? I demanded, my voice breaking. I didn't come here to. The answer came immediately. You already gave it. The warmth beneath me vanished. I fell through. Not down, not exactly. Sideways, like the world had turned a page and I slipped between paragraphs. The air knocked out of my lungs as I hit ground again, hard enough to knock stars into my vision. And I could breathe. I realized the forest was gone. I was standing at the edge of the creek. Daylight filtered through the trees. Morning birds called. My clothes were damp, smeared with mud and leaves. My boots lay neatly beside me, exactly where I'd left them before crossing. Time had folded, or something had set me back where it wanted me. Across the water, on the far bank, the woods waited, quiet again, patient, and carved into the trunk of the nearest tree, fresh, deep, and unmistakable, were new marks, 32 of them, all facing me. I stopped counting how long I'd been in that place because time had begun to misbehave, not in the dramatic way people imagine. No clock spinning backward, no sudden jumps, but in a quiet, more unsettling erosion. Hours felt thin, moments stretched without weight. I would sit with my back against the cellar wall, convinced only minutes had passed, and then hear the distant church bell outside strike a number that told me the day had almost bled out. The house no longer responded to me as a structure. It behaved like a body. The floorboards groaned when I shifted my weight, but not under my feet, behind me, above me, sometimes below, as if pressure was being redistributed through muscle and bone. The walls had developed a faint, persistent warmth, especially in the corridor that led toward the old well room. When I placed my palm against the plaster, it felt like resting a hand against skin stretched too tightly over something rigid, bone beneath flesh. I had not gone near the well since the night the sound changed. Before, it had been water, slow, patient dripping that echoed the way cellar always do. Now the noise was duller, thicker, as though whatever fell into that darkness no longer splashed, but struck something solid, wrapped in something softer. I told myself not to investigate again. I told myself many things that no longer held. That night, sleep took me without permission. I dreamed of kneeling in the dirt outside the house, my hands raw and bleeding, digging with a rhythm that felt rehearsed. Each scoop of soil revealed fragments, knuckles, jawlines, curved ribs still threaded with blackened sinew. I recognized none of them, yet the knowledge of where each belonged came instinctively, the way a butcher knows a carcass. In the dream, something stood behind me. It did not breathe. It did not move. It waited. When I awoke, my hands were clenched so tightly my nails had cut half wounds into my palms. And the smell was back, not rot, not decay, iron and damp earth. The smell of something that had been buried too shallow and remembered the shape of air. I followed it without deciding to. The hallway toward the well room felt narrower than it had before. The ceiling pressed low enough that I had to tilt my head slightly forward, an unconscious bow. The boards beneath my boots no longer creaked randomly. They answered my steps with a delayed echo, as if something below was stepping too. The door to the well room was open. It had been closed when I passed it last. Inside, the lantern I'd left on the hook still burned, though I knew I hadn't refilled it. The flame was low and steady, casting shadows that clung to the stone walls rather than dancing across them. The well itself dominated the room, an old, circular mouth lined with stone blocks smoothed by centuries of hands that had trusted it. A wooden lip ringed the opening, scarred with gouges I hadn't noticed before. Fresh marks, dragged, not struck. I leaned over the edge. The darkness below was not empty. Something pale shifted far beneath the waterline, just enough to catch the lantern light before sinking again. The sound came then, not dripping, not splashing, but a slow, deliberate knock. Bone on stone. Once, twice, then a pause, as if listening for my response. I staggered back, my heel catching on something hard. I looked down. A fragment lay on the floor behind me. Not a stone, a finger. It was old, yellowed, brittle, but still jointed. The knuckle intact, the nail split but present. It lay oriented toward the bell as if it had crawled that far and no further. My breath came shallow, involuntary, the way it does when the body decides panic before the mind can argue. I backed toward the doorway, eyes never leaving the well. The knocking stopped. In its place came movement, not upward, sideways. Stone scraped against stone from inside the walls themselves, a grinding shift like something repositioning its weight. The room seemed to narrow, the shadows tightening around the circle of the bell as if the darkness were being drawn inward. Then the voice spoke, not aloud, inside my head, layered beneath my own thoughts. You walk on what you forget. Images flooded in without sequence. Men digging by torchlight, the panic in their movements barely concealed beneath urgency. A body went wrong, limbs twisted where they shouldn't twist, the sound of soil thrown back too quickly, packed down by boots that didn't want to feel what lay beneath. Not murder, disposal, a crime of convenience. The bones had not belonged to one person, they had belonged to many, and the house had been built to hold them. I understood then, not in a neat revelation, but in the heavy, sinking way truth settles when it was always waiting. Bloody bones was not a singular thing, it was an accumulation, a memory that had learned to assemble itself when disturbed. Every step taken above it, every renovation, every nail driven into the foundation, each act had added pressure, shape, expectation, and now it had learned me. The floor shuddered. From the well came a sound like wet cloth being wrung out. Something rose, not fully, not yet, but enough that I saw the curve of a skull pressed just beneath the water's surface, pale and smooth where time had sourced it clean. Empty sockets tilted upward, not seeking sight, but alignment. The bones were finding their balance. I ran, not out of fear alone, but because the house had shifted behind me, blocking the path back the way I'd come. I bolted down the side passage instead, heart hammering hard enough that my vision tunneled. The walls seemed to breathe as I passed, exhaling cold, damp air that smelled of soil and iron. Behind me, the knocking resumed, faster now, more confident. The sound of something that no longer needed to test the space, something that knew how much room it required, and that the house was finally ready to give it. I didn't know where I was running anymore, only that stopping felt like consent. The side passage spit me into a part of the house I had never mapped, a stretch of rooms that should not have existed given the building's footprint. The ceilings here were lower, the angles wrong, the walls bowing inward as though pressure from beneath had forced the structure to compromise rather than crack. My lantern guttered but refused to die. That somehow was worse. The light revealed a series of doors, 5 of them, each mismatched, scavenged from different eras. One bore colonial iron hinges, another was thin, modern plywood, its surface warped by moisture. None of them were fully shut. Each stood open just enough to suggest invitation or warning. I chose the farthest one without knowing why. Inside was a narrow room with no windows and no furniture except a long wooden bench bolted to the floor. The air was thick here, stale and unmoving, heavy with the smell of old sweat and something sharper beneath it. Blood, not fresh, worked into the grain of the wood. I realized then what this place had been, not a cellar, not a storage space, but a holding room, a waiting room. The bench bore shallow grooves where hands had gripped too tightly, nails scraping his bodies were made to sit still when instinct screamed otherwise. Above the bench, carved directly into the wall, were tally marks, not days, people. The sound found me again, closer now, not from behind, from below. The knocking had changed its cadence, becoming almost curious. Each contact with stone landed heavier, more deliberate, as if whatever was assembling itself had learned patience and no longer needed to rush. The floor beneath my boots vibrated faintly. I pressed my ear against the wall, against instinct, against reason. There was movement inside it, not rodents, not pipes, weight shifting. Bones don't scrape like wood or metal. They chatter when they touch, a dry, delicate sound like porcelain brushed together. That sound traveled through the wall, muffled but unmistakable. accompanied by the soft drag of something pulling itself forward without felt, without flesh to cushion the effort. Then the house spoke again. This time, not in images, in memory. I saw myself arriving months earlier, confident, almost amused by the place. I remembered standing exactly where I now crouched, laughing softly at the realtor's nervous jokes about the cellar and the stories. I remembered thinking how easily history could be renovated away. The memory twisted. I watched myself through a perspective that wasn't mine, saw my boots press into the soil still compacted with old impressions, saw my weight redistribute through beams that had already been compromised long before I arrived. Pressure, the house seemed to say. You add pressure. The knocking stopped. Silence fell so suddenly it ran. Then came footsteps. Not many. One. Slow. Measured. Bones does not walk the way flesh does. There was no heel-to-toe rhythm, no swing of weight. Each step was a placement, carefully tested before committing, as if the thing was learning how to inhabit verticality. I backed toward the door. It closed on its own, not slammed, just eased shut, wood kissing wood with a sound that was almost polite. The footsteps approached the other side. I could see its shadow beneath the door. It did not resemble a human outline. The shape was wrong, too tall in places, too narrow in others, limbs extending at angles that suggested joint upon joint, stacked where no single body should allow. The shadow wavered, adjusted, as though the thing casting it were correcting posture mid-step. The handle rattled once, then stopped. A pause, then pressure, not pulling, not pushing, but leaning. The door bowed inward slightly, wood creaking under a distributed weight that did not concentrate where a hand should have been. The voice returned, clearer now, layered with many tones overlapping in imperfect harmony. We were laid down carefully once. The door cracked, just a finger's width. Through the gap I saw movement, not a face, not a skull, but an arrangement. Bones pressed together by intention rather than anatomy. Rib cage rotated sideways to serve as a torso. Arm bones lashed together with strips of dark, leathery matter that might once have been muscle or hide. The skulls, there were several, nested along what passed for a spine, some facing forward, others turned inward, as if still whispering to one another. One socket aligned with mine. Something like recognition passed through it. You walk upright because we were laid flat. The door gave way another inch. I screamed, not from fear alone, but from the unbearable wrongness of witnessing structure without design, purpose assembled from neglect. The lantern shattered as I threw it. Darkness swallowed the room, but not completely. The thing emitted its own dull luminescence, not light, but contrast. Pale surfaces caught what little ambient glow remained, enough to outline its shape as it forced itself through the narrowing gap, bones scraping, reconfiguring, learning how to compress. I clawed at the wall behind me. My hand found something loose, a stone. I wrenched it free. Cold air rushed in as the wall opened, not into another room, but into a narrow cavity barely wide enough for my shoulders. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself inside as the door finally splintered outward, wood cracking under a weight that no longer tested. Inside the cavity, the smell was unbearable. This was where the overflow had gone, bones packed tight, fused by time and pressure into a mass that no longer recognized individuality. They pressed against me from all sides, cool and smooth, as if the earth itself had grown a skeleton. Behind me, the thing entered the room. It did not rush. It did not need to. It knew there was nowhere left for me to go, and for the first time, I understood the true meaning of bloody bones, not a monster that haunted the house, but a consequence that rose when the past could no longer bear being buried beneath the living. I don't remember how long I stayed in that cavity. Time had dissolved into layers of sound, smell, and pressure. Every heartbeat became a drum against the walls, a warning to something that had been waiting centuries to be reminded of its own shape. The thing in the room was patient, not idle, not lingering. It simply allowed me to exist for observation. The faint luminescence from its pale bones outlined the splintered doorway, reflecting off the walls in fragments that made the room feel larger, almost infinite, though I knew it wasn't. My lungs burned from holding my breath. My ears rang from silence punctuated by the soft scraping of wood and stone. I peeked through the narrow cavity. The pile of bones had shifted, not violently, not animated, but subtly, incrementally, like sediment settling after a flood. Shapes rearranged, screws and nails of the old house had become wedges, supports for this vertical mass of the past. The rib cages leaned slightly forward, the spine arched where none had existed before, a jaw rotated inward, pressing against another in impossible alignment. It was learning me, and I could feel it. Every inch I had walked, every sound I had made, every misstep across the boards or over debris, it had been catalogued, measured, and stored inside that mass. The walls no longer held just me. They held me in context, and alongside everything else the house had collected, all the souls and bones and mistakes that had ever pressed against these floors. I tried to breathe quietly. The air trembled with some response, a faint draught or the exhalation of something below. My hand pressed against the stone beside me, feeling the tiny vibrations travel through the foundation. They weren't random, they were instruction, a language of mass and weight, of leverage and patience, spoken in the tremble of wood and stone. I realized then what it wanted, not me alive or dead, not yet, not entirely. It wanted cooperation, in the only form it understood. I had to fit into the world it had rebuilt from fragments, into the rhythm it had been perfecting since the first body fell to the mud. I tried to move, carefully, inching backward toward what little space remained in the cavity. The house groaned in response, low and deliberate, as though pressing in to measure the weight of my retreat. Behind the doorway, a soft shift resonated, bone scraping against bone, mud compressed under pressure, wood bending under age and gravity. It was testing the limits of the room, testing me. And then it spoke, not words, not in language I recognized, but a weight, a message pressed into my mind through vibration, pressure, and sound. You remember us, you feel us, you belong to the sequence. It was impossible to resist that, not logically, not physically. The house, the bones, the weight of every act committed and buried, they had aligned to make me complicit, and I realized with a cold clarity that escape wouldn't be a matter of running, not anymore. I would have to move in their terms, to navigate the mass, the structure, the geometry of memory and pressure. I inched out. Each step was catalogued immediately, reflected in the subtle rearrangement of bones I could just perceive beyond the door. The ribs, spines, and skulls adjusted like machinery, shifting their balance to anticipate the next human motion. I could feel the floorboards flex in response, the walls tighten, the air compress against my chest. By the time I cleared the cavity, I wasn't running anymore. I was measured. My body was a vector now, an object whose weight and intention had been recorded. The corridor stretched before me impossibly long, the faint echoes of a past I hadn't fully seen pressing on either side. I could hear the knocking resume behind me, closer now, faster, not chaotic, but insistent, like punctuation, like the beat of some enormous, unseen drum. Each knock synchronized with my own heartbeat until I couldn't tell which was mine. And in that rhythm, the message became clear. Bloody Bones didn't just occupy space, it redefined it. It was hunting. It was not hunting in real. It was not even seeking revenge. It was teaching. And I was the pupil. I moved forward because I had no choice but to move forward. And every step I took, I could feel it learning the new weight of me. The house, the bones, the history. It was all alive and I was finally woven into its memory. The house had become a creator in its own right. I knew that now, not metaphorically, not as a feeling, but physically. Every wall, every floorboard, every stone in the foundation had memory. Each joint responded, leaned, shifted, anticipated me. I could feel it with every step, every breath. It wasn't merely observing anymore. It was interacting, collaborating with the mass beneath it, the assembly of bones that had been learning me for hours or days or weeks. Time had lost meaning here. The corridor stretched before me like a tunnel inside some living thing. Shadows flickered against the walls, not cast by lanterns or moonlight, but by the bones themselves, reflected in the low, pale luminescence that seemed to radiate from the floor and walls. The knocking continued behind me, faster now, almost urgent. It didn't chase me. It pressed, it measured, it whispered in the language of weight and imbalance. I paused in the center of the hallway. The air here was thick, suffocating, carrying the metallic tang of iron and decay. My boot struck slightly to the floor as though the earth itself were hesitant to let me leave. I realized I wasn't alone in a conventional sense. I was walking through a network of pressure, of observation, of countless bodies rearranged and compressed into a single intelligence. Then it rose. From the room I had fled moments ago, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell. It emerged slowly, impossibly. A mass of bones fused into a semi-human form, yet every line and angle wrong, alien, vertical where it should have been horizontal. Skulls stacked upon skull like towers, spines arcing where no vertebra should, limbs fused by what looked like dried sinew, and time itself. It moved with patience I had never felt in the natural world, each step perfectly calibrated to the structure around it, to me, to the air I breathed. It did not speak, it communicated. A pressure wave hit me as I took the first deliberate step down the hallway. The floorboards groaned, wood stretched, walls shivered, not in fear, not in resistance, but in acknowledgement of the being's weight. I could feel it in my chest, a deep resonance that made my bones ache in sympathy. I tried to run, but my legs felt like they belonged to someone else. Each movement was catalogued by the thing, mirrored in subtle shifts beneath my feet, in walls adjusting minutely, the house itself anticipating me. Escape wasn't a choice. Compliance was the only way to survive. And then I understood the full scope. Bloody Bones was not a singular creature. It was everything the house had absorbed. Every body, every fragment, every act of violence or misfortune that had been buried beneath the foundation or along the creek had become part of this entity. It didn't hunt in the conventional sense. It reclaimed. The mass paused halfway down the hallway, the skulls tilted, sockets empty but somehow seeing, tracking me, measuring me. I could feel my heart being counted, my breath timed, my weight distributed across the floor as if the entire house were a scale. I had become an object of study, variable in an experiment that had been running for centuries. I tried to speak, my voice cracked, nothing more than a rasp. What do you want? Silence answered me. A deep, resonant click vibrated along the walls, the floor, the air itself. Then a low hum, almost imperceptible, began rising from the room behind me, building slowly. It wasn't music, not sound in any human sense. It was resonance, pressure modulating, bone adjusting, the accumulated knowledge of every act, every body, every misstep, every person who had ever stepped here. The hum grew, my skin vibrated, the walls leaned inward, compressing, the floor seemed to bow slightly under me. I realized that the corridor itself had become part of the being. It wasn't just behind me, it was beneath me, around me, part of me now. I collapsed to my knees. Overwhelmed, the entity stepped closer, bone pressing against air, shaping the space, demanding acknowledgement. I could feel the scrape of its ribs, the shift of its jaw towers, the alignment of countless skulls as if they were counting every fraction of my existence. And then the air changed. The smell, iron, wet earth, old rot, was everywhere, saturating my lungs. I coughed, gagged, and tasted blood, though I hadn't been cut. The bones of the past were pressing against the present, merging history into immediacy. I realized survival won't come from running, not from screaming, not from hiding. It would come from understanding the rules, from moving in rhythm with it. I had no choice but to walk, slowly, deliberately, in sync. Each step I took, the entity shifted, compressing, adjusting, guiding. Its form became less monstrous in movement, more like a complex machine, perfect in its maladapted geometry. It mirrored me, but not my shape, my weight, my timing, the subtle pressure of my presence in the world. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time was irrelevant. The corridor stretched, folded, reformed. Every inch I traveled was catalogued, measured, stored. I realized then that the thing wasn't satisfied with simply existing. It needed perpetuation. My survival wasn't mercy. It was continuation, a witness, a participant in its assembly of memory and mass. Finally, the entity receded, not vanished, not destroyed, but compressed back into the room I had fled before, leaving the corridor quiet. I was alone, or almost. The house hummed faintly, a reminder, a pulse. The smell lingered. The floorboards groaned under weight I could not see, and yet I was still alive. I had been measured, I had been weighed, I had been recorded, and in that moment, I understood the truth about bloody bones. It wasn't bound by time. It wasn't confined to flesh. It didn't hunt the living. It integrated them. It absorbed motion, memory, and presence until nothing remained separate. And I knew with a certainty that would never leave me, that the house would always remember me, even now, even long after I walked away, even when I thought I had escaped. Bloody Bones never forgets.